So let's create a new variable down at the bottom above styles called register mutation. And we'll use GQL and pass in our copied mutation between those backticks. And now we can supply this mutation to our mutation component. So we'll find the opening tag for mutation, we'll uncomment it, and we'll uncomment the closing tag as well. So just as the query component has a query prop, the mutation component has a mutation prop, which we pass our written mutation to. We called it register mutation. But before we can execute this mutation, we need to get access to and store the values that a user's typed into each of the inputs for username, email, and password. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to store them in state. So we'll get the text that a user's typed into a given input with the help of the onChange event, and then we're going to put the input's value in a separate piece of state which corresponds to the name of the input. So since we have a function component, in order to introduce state, we're going to use the special useState hook from React. So up at the top, where we're importing React, we can bring in useState, and we're going to create some state for each of our three inputs, and we'll do so by executing useState, and we can pass in a default value for the piece of state that we're creating. In our case, we'll just include an empty string, which is the default state of any input. Then when we execute useState, we'll get this default value put in a variable that we declare with const. And there's actually two variables that we'll declare because there are two values returned from useState between a set of brackets. And the first value is going to be the state value. So for our first input, that's going to be our username state. So we're going to give it that name. And then the second value that we get access to is actually a function that allows us to set this value. So when using a normal class-based component, we had access to, on the class, a method called setState. When it comes to the useState hook, the setter is given according to each piece of state that we create. So there's a specific setter function just for the username piece of state, and we call that setUsername. And the same thing is going to apply for our other inputs, for our email and password inputs. So we can just copy this and paste this in two more times. The next piece of state that we'll create will be for the email input, and the setter is going to be called setEmail. So every setter is going to be prepended with the word set. And then our last piece of state is going to be for our password, and this is going to be, the setter for it's going to be setPassword. When a user types into a given input, we want to listen for a certain event to update our state, namely the change event. So on each of our inputs, we can add an onChange where we can get access to the event that took place, and we can use each appropriate setter to update our state by taking the event that's given to us when there's a change event and then writing an inline arrow function where in the return of this function we can call the respective setter. So for the username input, when there's a change event, when a user types into the input, we can call setUsername, and we can get the text value from the input by accessing event.target.value. And now we can add this onChange handler to each of our inputs. The only difference is that for the email input, the setter is going to be setEmail, and for the password, it'll be setPassword. Now if we save our register component and we try typing into these inputs, when we open up our console once again, and this time use the React DevTools by clicking the arrow and going down to React, and then within the search, searching for our register component, we see that within the hooks area are separate pieces of state. Now we don't have the names for them, we can see that when we type into the username input, the first piece of state is updated, and then the same for the email and password inputs.